Well, hello. It's Wednesday after Easter. Now, you may be wondering, well, why are you doing a video and a podcast on the week after Easter on a Wednesday? Well, the reason goes back to what we read in Matthew and Mark on Easter Sunday. Read here in Mark 16:7. Go, this is the angel speaking, go tell his disciples that he's risen from the dead, and tell Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you. Now, I don't know about you, but if you convince me that an angel has told you that Jesus is going to be in Galilee and is going to appear to you, I'm going to hightail it to Galilee. Now, let's get it out on the table that it is very difficult to harmonize the four Gospels with regard to the resurrection appearances. It's very hard to do it unless you fudge a few things. And so, and I think it's revealing also that if you compare Luke 24 to Acts 1, mind you, both by the same author, in Luke 24, we would get the impression that Jesus never went to that the disciples never went to Galilee after the resurrection, and that Jesus only appeared to them around Jerusalem. And in fact, that Jesus, in Luke 24, reads like Jesus rose from the dead and ascended to heaven on the same day. But then suddenly we go to Acts 1, and we have a 40-day period between Jesus' resurrection and his ascension. What I'm getting at is there was artistry allowed in the telling of history, such that some things could be compressed, some things could be syncopated, and so I think it's misguided. It's misguided, in my opinion, to try to harmonize the four Gospels on a historical level. Now, we can do historical reconstruction, but trying to shove them all together in some kind of a detailed way, it just doesn't seem to match the nature of ancient history writing. That having been said, let's go ahead and suggest that the men on the road to Emmaus was on Easter Sunday, and that Jesus appeared to the disciples on Easter evening. Let's go ahead and assume that. But we know from Matthew and Mark that Jesus, the angels, told the women that Jesus was going to appear to them in Galilee. And so I guarantee you, on Monday morning after Easter, at the very latest, the disciples were hightailing it back to Galilee in order that they could see Jesus. I mean, wouldn't you? Like I said, if an angel tells me, hey, Jesus is going to be in Galilee, why don't you go see him? I'm going to be hightailing it up the Jordan River to get to Galilee. And so I'm giving this talk about John 21 and Matthew 28 on Wednesday because the trip from Jerusalem back to Galilee was about a 3-day trip. And so Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, I think it's pretty likely that by sometime on Wednesday, Peter was back in Capernaum. And of course, Capernaum is on the Sea of Galilee. And surprise, surprise, it's on the Sea of Galilee that Jesus appears in John 21. So let's go to John 21 now. Now, I'm not going to read all of John 21, but I want to talk about Jesus' appearance to some of the disciples by the Sea of Galilee. What's very interesting to me is that Luke says, when the men on the road to Emmaus get back to Jerusalem, they say, some of our women found the tomb empty, and Jesus has appeared to Peter. Now, we know from 1 Corinthians 15 that Peter was the first apostle. Now, I'm not including Mary Magdalene. Peter was the first male apostle to whom Jesus appeared after the resurrection. What is fascinating is, at first glance, none of the Gospels tell us this. Matthew doesn't record Jesus appearing to Peter. Mark doesn't record Jesus appearing to Peter. Luke only mentions that Jesus appeared to Peter. Why? This is the first appearance, the most important appearance. In one sense, why don't any of the Gospels actually tell us about Jesus' appearance to Peter? And of course, it raises the question, could John 21 be the memory of Jesus' appearance to Peter? Now, admittedly, that's not the way John presents it. John presents this as the third appearance that Jesus did. One to the disciples on Sunday night, one to Thomas a week later, and then this is said to be the third. By the same token, it could be argued that John is a highly symbolic gospel that moves some things around. So, for example, the cleansing of the temple takes place in the first year of Jesus' ministry in John, whereas in all the other gospels, it takes place in the last week of Jesus' life. Again, I'm brainstorming with you here and simply pointing out that it's difficult to harmonize these things. Now, that's a sign of historicity, right? Don't take this as a negative, because variations among accounts suggest that there was a core event. So this is not something that should be troubling to anybody. But all of that aside, let's read about Jesus' appearance to a small group of the disciples by the Sea of Galilee in John 21. Verse 1, after these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, which is Sea of Galilee, and he showed himself in this way. Gathered there together were Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Didymus, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, I'm reading from the New RSV, by the way, the sons of Zebedee, James and John, and two others of his disciples. Now, we know one of these is the beloved disciple, but he doesn't tell us which one. It's almost like he's being cryptic about it. Of course, traditionally, we would think it's John, the son of Zebedee, but it's also possible to read this that one of the two anonymous disciples is actually the beloved disciple. Verse 3, Simon Peter said to them, I'm going fishing. They said, we'll go with you. So they went out, they got into the boat, but they caught nothing that night. Verse 4, just after daybreak, Jesus stood on the beach, but the disciples did not know it was Jesus. Jesus said to them, children, you have no fish, have you? They said, no. He said, cast the net to the right side of the boat, and you'll find some. So they cast it, and now they were not able to haul it in because there were so many fish. That disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, it's the Lord. When Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on some clothes, for he was naked. He jumped into the sea, but the other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far from the land, only about 100 yards off. When they got ashore, they saw a charcoal fire there with fish on it and bread. And Jesus said, bring the fish that you've caught. So Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore, full of large fish. 153. What is the significance of 153? Nobody really knows. There's several guesses, but the bottom line is we don't really know. Although there were so many, the net was not torn. And Jesus said, come have breakfast. Now none of the disciples dared ask him, who are you? They knew it was the Lord. This is that theme again that we saw on Sunday of the people not exactly recognizing Jesus. Verse 13, Jesus came, he took the bread, he gave it to them, and he did the same with the fish. Now this was the third time that Jesus appeared to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. I won't read the rest of the chapter. Feel free to go ahead and read it. Jesus has a little discussion with Peter. 3 times Jesus asks Peter if he loves him, and the third time kind of cuts Peter to the quick, because Peter denied Jesus 3 times, and here Jesus asks him 3 times if he loves him. There is a little variation in the word for love. Jesus says the first time, Peter, do you agapao me? And Peter responds, Lord, you know I phileo you. And then the second time, Jesus says, do you agapao me? Peter says, Lord, you know I phileo you. Then the third time, Jesus says, Peter, do you phileo me? And Jesus says, do you phileo me? And Peter responds, Lord, you know I phileo you. Some have suggested that Jesus is asking, Peter, do you love me on the high level? And Peter responds, I love you on the low level. And then finally, Jesus comes down to his level. That's very tantalizing because of the way that Jesus switches on the third time. But most scholars would say that these really are roughly synonymous terms. Scholars are party poopers, aren't they? But there really isn't good evidence that agapao has a really different meaning than phileo here. But you can believe whatever you want, because it is tantalizing, because Jesus switches to phileo the third time. Jesus tells Peter how he's going to die, says he's going to be crucified, implies that. And of course, Peter wants to know, well, what about the beloved disciple? And Jesus says, that's none of your business. And there came to be a rumor that the beloved disciple would live until Jesus came, but Jesus didn't actually say that. Well, so this is Jesus' appearance in Galilee. That's what we're doing today. We're doing appearances of Jesus in Galilee. And the first one I wanted to mention was here in John 21. There's one more. So Matthew doesn't tell us anything about that appearance, nor does Mark, nor does Luke, because Luke doesn't even mention Galilee. But we do have in Matthew 28 another instance of Jesus appearing to the disciples in Galilee, and that is when he gives the Great Commission, verse 16 in Matthew 28. Now the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain which Jesus had directed them, and when they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted, which is very interesting. And Jesus came and said to them, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations. By the way, this is not before the ascension. People have a tendency to think that Jesus says this in a sense, but this is in Galilee. The ascension will be back in Jerusalem. Let me keep going. Go therefore, make disciples of all nations. So this is a command to disciple everybody in the world that will. And how do you do it? How do you make a disciple? Well, first of all, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. And secondly, teaching them to obey everything that I commanded you. So making a disciple isn't a matter of, here, pray this prayer. Making a disciple is a process that involves teaching. And so it's not something that happens in a day or even a week. Making a disciple requires a longer term investment than just a day or a week or maybe even a month. And so they are to go to all the world. And remember, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. Now, this is the way the Gospel of Matthew ends. And so you understand why it's tempting to think of this as the point where he ascends to heaven. But that's not the case. Jesus' ascension takes place from Jerusalem. And so it would seem that at some point, after they've gone to Galilee and Jesus has appeared to them, they decide we need to go back to Jerusalem because that's where Jesus will return, right? And so they return to Jerusalem. Now, I don't know what the time frame is, but on this Sunday night, I want to look at John 20 and Jesus' appearance to Thomas a week after Jesus rose from the dead.